Hi friends, Molten here and welcome back to my Journey to GM series. Today I'm going over a game I played in the Sydney International in 2007 against Grandmaster Viktor Michalevski, one of my favorite opponents to play because we always seem to get some very interesting and exciting attacking games. So in the game I went for a Benoni type structure and it led to something very reminiscent of a famous game Kasparov played against Korchnoi. So stick around and I hope you enjoy this video. So the following game started out with d4, knight f6, c4, e6. So I was playing into a Nimzo-Indian at the time. After the move pawn to g3, I really wanted to go for something a little bit more imbalanced. And instead of d5, what you can do here is play the move pawn to c5. If you want to go into a Benoni structure after d5, pawn takes, and d6, knight c3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, we've transposed into a mainline modern Benoni, but one where the light squared bishop is sort of stuck behind this d5 pawn. And I don't mind transposing into this variation since I believe that the bishop is not as effective as it would be in some of the main lines. So after the move knight to f3, castles, rook e8. So the whole point of this move is to prevent white from playing the move pawn to e4. And white does a very standard maneuver in this type of position, and that is to bring the knight into this c4 square by playing the move knight to d2. Here I played the move pawn to a6, which is very normal for black since we have this queenside pawn majority to be pushing with the move pawn to b5 in the Benoni. So after the move a4, very standard response, I played the move knight to d7. White played h3. So this move here is to take away some squares from black's pieces. So at some point I'm going to put my knight into the e5 square, and then when white plays the move pawn to f4 to chase it away, then I won't have this g4 square for my knight. So this is the whole point of h3, a very useful waiting move. Here I played the move rook to b8. The point of this is just to go for b5. White played the move knight to c4, and here I played the move knight to e5. Offering an exchange of knights. In the case of knight takes e5, I would have played the move rook takes e5, and if bishop f4 or pawn to f4, it may be tempting to sort of swing the rook across to h5 here, but I think the rook is a little bit misplaced, so just a simple retreat back is probably totally fine for black. In these positions, you really want to just make sure that white can't get in this pawn advance f4, e4, and then e5. So as long as you keep an eye on this pawn advance, then black should be fine, and you focus on your own counterplay on the queen side with b5 instead. Now what happened in the game was after knight e5, my opponent played the move knight to a3. I played the move knight to h5. Pawn to e4 was played, and here I played the move rook to f8. So far we're actually following a very famous game played between Korchnoi and Kasparov in very similar position. The whole point of rook f8 is that the rook is no longer useful on the e8 square, and instead we're trying to prepare this f5 pawn advance. Black has to be a little bit careful here because our knights don't have too many squares to go to, and white's idea with knight a3 is sort of to keep this e5 knight on the board and later on just to chase it backwards, in which case black won't have too many good retreat squares. King h2 was played. Here I played the move pawn to f5, pawn to f4. So this is very similar to the stem game I mentioned. In that Kasparov game, b5 happened in this particular position. And after the move pawn to b5, pawn captures, knight takes b5 was played by Korchnoi, and here Kasparov continued with the move f takes e4, bishop takes e4, and bishop to d7, attacking this knight here. And the whole point of this combination is that we're trying to create as much counterplay as possible on the queen side sort of to counter the fact that our knight is hanging. Mind you, if I go back a few moves, just to point out that pawn takes here is met by an advance in the center, or we can even take here on e5 first, threatening the g3 pawn and continuing on with the move pawn to b4. But after bishop d7, queen e2 was played in that game. Kasparov continued with queen to b6. Again, if captures here on e5, Kasparov was going to capture on e5 with the bishop, just sacrificing a piece. But we're attacking the g3 pawn here with the knight. We're also threatening to win our piece back with bishop takes b5. The game continued rook to e8, bishop to d2, and queen takes b2. The knight is still hanging on e5, but the point is that we're going to get a lot of compensation for it. Bishop takes, even with the move knight to c4 here. Kasparov throws in knight takes g3. So if captures here on b2, then we can capture the queen and then also get a discovered check. So we have rook takes f8, queen e1, knight takes e4, discovered check, king g2, queen c2, knight takes e5, rook f2 check, queen takes f2, and now Kasparov wins the queen and gets a very pleasant position. After queen f5, knight takes d7, knight back. Black is just a lot of material up here and goes on to win the game in very nice fashion. So if we go back to move 17, so in this position, I was going for a very similar idea, but instead of playing the move b5 straight away, I opted for something a little bit different, which was the move bishop to d7. I thought this may have been a slight improvement on the game, but not totally sure. After bishop d7, my opponent took here on f5, and my idea was to just take back on f5 with the bishop. And here my plan was to sacrifice quite a number of pieces. If my opponent was to accept the sacrifice, I would have just taken back. And I was going to answer maybe knight e2 with ideas of b5, as well as queen to h4 was another one of my ideas in this position. I also have ideas of bishop g4, which I might have considered as well at some point. Maybe queen here first and then bishop g4, or knight takes g3 ideas, or b5. I felt like there was quite a lot of compensation here for black. So after knight e2, my opponent didn't actually take it. I played the move knight to d3 here, attacking the bishop, attacking the pawn. Here I was quite happy because I thought that the only way for white to get counterplay was to go g4, but then at worst case I was going to win a bunch of pawns. So after g4, knight takes c1, so I went for the bishop pair here. Knight takes c1, and I immediately went bishop takes b2. Now if queen takes c1, my idea is to go, I believe, bishop d3. Attacking the knight is very strong here. So I don't even have to sacrifice any material here. And same goes with rook takes. I would have just taken on b2. So knight takes c1. Bishop takes b2. So the fork here doesn't matter because we're attacking the rook. We have rook a2. Bishop takes c1. Queen takes c1. And then I captured on g4. Bishop takes g4. Pawn takes, queen h4 check. The idea being bishop h3 is met by queen g3 and queen takes bishop. So we have king to g1. I played queen takes g4 here. Knight to c4. And this is probably where I start to make some inaccuracies, because so far I think it was the correct decision to go for all these pawns because black has a lot of compensation here. Knight takes f4, knight takes d6, and I make a somewhat silly decision here to leave white with his only chance of counterplay, which is the d pawn. So if you see your opponent with any possible chance of counterplay, well, you should try to get rid of it as quickly as possible. Here I was looking at all sorts of difficult moves such as knight to e2, which I was trying to make work, but it just wasn't working. I think my opponent can just sacrifice the exchange and even just take on c5, and still has the passed d pawn. Not really sure if this is enough for black. So after knight takes d6, I opted for knight takes g2, rook takes, and for some reason after the move rook queen d4 check, initially my whole idea was to take this pawn, and I probably should just take the pawn. I mean, I should exchange rooks and then take on d5. That should be, goes without saying, I think, but I was starting to see some threats which probably aren't even there. I think I was worried about something along the lines of knight going to f7 and maybe some checkmates happening. Probably nothing really to worry about. But I opted for the move rook f3. I think this is totally unnecessary because now it gives white a chance to actually hang on to the pawn. And I think this is just a blunder, because after queen c4, now I'm forced to trade off rooks anyway. So rook takes, and we get into basically a very similar position. But despite having 3 pawns for the piece, here white has this important passed d pawn, and it's important not to give your opponent too many winning chances like this, and we should have just taken that winning chance off the board when we had a chance. So b5, rook d8. So now we're trying to win the pawn back. After captures, unfortunately after knight b6, we can't really hang on to it. So b4, threatening to play rook here. So it doesn't work. Also, these pawns on the queen side are now blockaded by the knight. It's important that white doesn't lose this pawn on d5 though, because it's not possible to win with a rook versus knight, rook and knight versus rook. h4, rook check, the king marches up the board. So we try to push our kingside pawns, but it's just not enough there, and eventually white finds a nice way to blockade the pawns, and here the threat of rook checkmate is just too strong. Therefore I resigned here. So you can see it's not that straightforward to beat a grandmaster, and they're very resilient. Even after doing your preparation and getting a good position, you still have to be very careful to finish it off and not allow too many chances, and keeping that d pawn on the board gave white a little bit too much counterplay. So I hope you enjoyed this video and a few things about the Benoni. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one. Take care.